Will Goldstein here, thekingscourt.com. Again, if you've been watching these videos, there's a place down there you can hit the button and subscribe. And again, a musician. I just released an album, my 9th album, All Hail the King. And that should be out in a few days. It's already at my distributor, so usually it's just a few days. It'll be out there on my website if you want to check out those songs. And I've also got loads of songbooks. But anyway, it's all at thekingscourt.com. Again, C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. And this is video 18. And the title of this video is Forgiveness. So he starts off by saying, among the Christian virtues, one of the most unpopular ones in those Christian virtues is the Christian rule, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Because, he says, the neighbor includes your enemy. And so we're really up against a terrible problem there and a duty to forgive our enemies. Then he says, everyone thinks that forgiveness is a lovely idea until they have really someone who seriously offended them and they are supposed to forgive them. Then he gives an example of maybe during war. And he says, when people think of this idea, this subject, it's often greeted with howls of anger. Basically, I can't never forgive for what they've done. So then he goes on to say, well, I wonder how you'd feel about forgiving the Gestapo if you were a Jew or a Pole. Christianity tells me that I must not deny my religion to save myself even from death or torture. And then he says, I wonder what it would be like if it came to that point. In other words, he wonders what he would do. It is perfectly clear that in Scripture that if we don't forgive, we shall not be forgiven. He doesn't quote this, he just says that statement, but it is in Scripture. It's Matthew 6:5. I'm paraphrasing. If you don't forgive others, then your Father will not forgive you. I wonder sometimes, even within myself, I wonder if there's some terrible things that have happened to me. And, I keep going back to that because I believe you have to keep reminding yourself that all the things that maybe you have done and that God is forgiving you when you see the things that other people have done to you. There are two things that can make it easier in trying to do this. And he says, he thinks that you should start with something easier, and perhaps like forgiving your husband or your wife or your parents or your children. Maybe they said something or did something that really offended you. And secondly, we ought to understand what loving your neighbor as yourself really means. And this is where he goes into this. And he's trying to figure out and give all kinds of examples of what that could possibly really mean. And then he does a pretty good job explaining it. Loving your neighbor doesn't mean that you really are particularly fond of him or even like him. He might be a real brute. He says, loving my enemies did not mean thinking that they're nice. Maybe they're not nice. Then he goes on and he has a revelation. In my most clear-sighted moments, he's talking about himself. He doesn't think that he's really a nice man. It's interesting that that's what C.S. Lewis says about himself. I look at some of the things that I've done, and I'll just add the word with loathing. He goes on to worse, but I like C.S. Lewis too much to add some of the things that he said about himself. Christian teachers tell me that I must hate the sin, but not the sinner. Then he asks the question, well, how can you hate what a man has done or said and not really hate the man? And he was thinking about it, and then he was pondering how this could possibly be, and then he realized years later it occurred to him that he had been doing this all his life. Namely, he loves himself. So however much I dislike, and then he says my cowardice, I don't think he's a coward, but that's what he says about himself, or conceit, or greed. Apparently that's what he felt about himself. I went on loving myself. So the whole point is that he really went on loving himself, even though he realized all the terrible things that he could see were really true about himself. Maybe that other people may or may not have seen, but that he knew. The very reason why I hated the things was the fact that I loved the man, being himself. So, and that, like I said, he said, that's the very reason why I hated these things. In other words, what he's saying is, I love myself. How could I possibly have ever done these things? I have felt that many times. I was sorry I was the sort of man that did those things. Christianity does not want us to reduce our hatred for being cruel or treachery. We ought to hate them. There are certain things that in my mind that I have thought of, and part of me wanted to do it. In other words, I am not a vengeful person. I could never get myself to be vengeful. I just can't do it not because I didn't want to at times. There are times that I really, truly wanted to be vengeful because horrible things were done. And I'm not dismissing those horrible things. They were horrible. But I could never get myself to lower myself to be vengeful. Christianity wants us to hate these things and other people that are doing them, but it has the hope that if there's any way possible that somehow that person can be cured and made human again. When you look at some of the atrocities that are done today in the world, the comments have been made, they are not even human. The atrocities are so horrifying. So that's what he says. They could be cured to made human again. So he's saying whatever they've done, his hope, his wish is that they could stop and see it for what they've done and change and be human again instead of a beast. He doesn't say that. I'm saying that. When one reads a story of all the horrible atrocities in the paper, suppose that the story might be discovered that it might not quite be true. Then you can ask yourself, if it's not as bad as it was made out to be, what is a person's first feeling? Are they, thank God they aren't quite so bad? Or is it a feeling of disappointment, a determination to cling to the first story, just the sheer pleasure, he says, of thinking your enemies as being as bad as possible? If it's the second, then if you follow that trend to the end, it'll make us into devils, is what he says. If we wish to see gray as black, then, well, eventually white will start to become black. And we'll start to see everything, God included, in our friends, ourselves, everything is being bad. And then we'll be caught into the habit of that. We won't be able to stop doing it. And the issue will be fixed forever in a universe of pure hatred. Think about all the revenge that's going out, in the wars that are happening today. Hatred based on, in some cases, thousands of years even of hatred. Loving myself does not mean I ought to subject myself to punishment. But on the other hand, he said, if a person commits murder, it's perfectly right for a Christian judge to sentence that man to death. He mentions the Christian soldiers or a soldier killing an enemy if you're in war. That's different than actual murder. You're in a war, and it might be a just cause for that war. Augustine has a treatise on supporting the idea of war. So it's no good quoting "thou shalt not kill," There are two Greek words that are associated with the word kill, and one means in the context is to actually kill, just kill, and the other one is to murder. And that's the second one, is to murder. And when Christ quotes that commandment, he uses the word murder. In other words, thou shalt not murder. He's not saying thou shalt not go to war and kill. He's saying thou shalt not murder. Those are two different things. The idea of the Christian in arms for the defense of a good cause is one of the great Christian ideas. Again, Augustine, he wrote a treatise for the justification of war. Christians think man lives forever. That's what they believe. So he says what really matters is those little marks on your soul, those twists inside you that are put on your soul when you, by all the things that you do, and as the accumulation of all those in the long run are going to make you into a heavenly or a hellish creature. He's saying we may kill if necessary. If that's what it amounts to us, to what we must be done, then we should do that. But we must not hate, or in even worse, enjoy hating. We may punish, but we must not enjoy punishing. Feelings of resentment must be simply killed. He uses the word killed there. I do not mean that anyone can decide that he will never feel it anymore, because you can't really control necessarily what you feel. What he's saying is that every time it bobs its head up, that we must hit it on the head. In other words, when you're aware that that's creeping up inside you, you must actively take and pursue a means to stop it. He says, hit it on the head. So we must try to feel about the enemy, to wish that he was not really so bad, and to hope that he may be cured, to wish his good. That's what we should think about our enemy, that he should be saved, for example. And that is what is meant by loving him, wishing his good. This means loving people who have nothing lovable about them. I'll say that again. This means even loving people who have nothing lovable about them. And then when you think about oneself, is there anything lovable really about you? There may be some things lovable about you, but there probably are some certain things that are not quite so lovable about you. But you love yourself simply because you are yourself. And God loves us not for anything nice about us or any attractive qualities that we think that we may have, but he loves us because we are souls, we are cells, we're people, we're his creation. That's why he loves us. There is nothing else in us, perhaps, to love. The reason why he says that is because we're creatures that find things like hatred as a pleasurable thing to do. And if that's the case, then perhaps we should really pursue the idea of forgiveness and change who we are.